Hello, everyone. I'm Olympia. Thank you for being here with me in this wonderful place called Lights Out Library. And I have a great story to tell you. But before we begin, allow yourself to forget about any worries. If you wish to, you may close your eyes and immerse yourself in the story. Assume a comfortable position. Maybe move a bit to settle. Take a long, deep, relaxing breath. And when you slowly exhale, feel your shoulders drop. Release the tension in your neck. Let your face soften and your jaw relax. Make sure your fingers are not clenched and that your legs are relaxed too. And allow the sound of my voice to guide you through this journey. First, let's explore a Maya world creation myth. There was a time at the very beginning of the world when only the sky and the sea existed as far as one can see. There was only this monotonous expanse of water under an empty sky. But there were beings in this world. There were gods, and 7 gods gathered. 4 of them were the guardians of the 4 angles of the universe, and there were 3 more. Tepeu, the worker god; Kukulkan, the feathered serpent covered in green feathers; and Urakan, the god of wind, of storms, and of fire. These 7 divine entities shined in the dark, and if there had been any other living creature around to see them, their light would have been blinding. But there was none, and that was the topic of their conversation. The world was empty, dull, and needed to be populated by beings that would know the existence of the gods and worship them. So they agreed to start modeling the world. And Urakan, the god of winds and fire, started the process by throwing lightning bolts, by making the thunder roll, and by shouting the word earth. Immediately in this chaos, the land began to emerge from the sea. Mountains rose towards the sky in a deafening noise. Valleys formed. Large plains and deserts appeared as the water receded. And that wasn't all. The power of Urakan also made vegetation grow in these landscapes, covering them in all shades of green. The other gods watched this and liked this new world, which was now more varied and interesting, but still empty of beings. One of the gods observed that this world would be useless if there was no one to congratulate and worship them. The gods thought they should now create beings, and they started working on it. Each of them used their imagination, and this was how they created the first inhabitants of Earth: the birds, the snakes, and the beasts. They didn't only create them in all sorts of colors, sizes, and species. They also gave them a language, a different language for each species, in the hope that all these animals would sing their praises and use their language to glorify their creators. Finally, they decided that these animals would be the guardians of the plants. Once they were done, the gods gathered again and told the animals that it was now time for them to start singing their praises, honoring the gods, and celebrating this wonderful creation. But it didn't go as planned. The animals were not intelligent enough, and all they could do was chirp, hiss, or roar. The gods were disappointed and realized that the animals they had created were far from perfect. So they sentenced the animals to be forever hunted and eaten, and decided to move on. They needed to create other beings that would be sensitive and smart enough to show gratitude to their creators. They decided to create humans. But what material would be appropriate? They thought of clay, and with clay they molded an entire people of human beings. They animated them and gave them a language. But once again, the results were disappointing. The sculptures could move and speak, but they turned out to be as stupid as the animals that had preceded them. They were stiff, they couldn't turn their heads, and they didn't feel anything, which made them unable to correctly worship their creators. That was another failure. So the gods destroyed these failed clay humans and searched for a building material that would produce more intelligent creatures. They thought of wood, and soon wooden humans populated the emerged world. They could speak, they reproduced, and they had abilities that their clay predecessors lacked, like using tools or building houses. But these wooden humans were still heartless and limited. They showed no curiosity, no feelings, and they completely ignored their creators because they lived in the most superficial layer of their conscience, unable to dig deeper and become spiritual. Once again, the gods were disappointed, and they condemned this second race of humans to disappear. They sent a dark, thick rain over the world, and only a handful of these wooden humans survived, finding refuge in the woods where, according to the legend, their descendants still live, having taken the form of little monkeys that live in the trees. Once again the gods congregated and spoke of the material they could use for their next attempt. They needed a substance noble enough that could be used to make the flesh and blood of humans, and would give them life and strength, but also intelligence and emotions. As they were thinking, 4 animals came to them and told them that they knew a material that corresponded to their search. The animals took the gods to a place where there was wild corn growing. The animals took the yellow and white grains of corn, crushed them, and added water to form a paste. They offered this paste to the gods and told them that they should make humans with it. The gods tried it and made 4 humans with that corn paste, and this time it worked. These humans were very intelligent and sensitive. They worshipped their creators instinctively and called them by their names. Their sight was also perfect, even in the dark. They could see so far away that they saw the limits of the universe and could not only see, but understand the true nature of the cosmos. And they were so smart that they quickly became as knowledgeable and capable as the gods. This was starting to become worrisome for the gods. Maybe these humans were a bit too perfect. So the gods decided to limit their powers. They obscured their sight. The four men could no longer see the whole universe. Instead, they were now limited to their immediate surroundings. And with the loss of this perception, the loss of the understanding of the nature, the dimensions, and the limits of the world, the men lost most of their wisdom and intelligence. Sentenced as they were to live in a world they could not really comprehend, lost in a partial vision that would make them develop ill-informed prejudices and desperately search for a meaning that they were now unable to grasp. Still, some of their intelligence and sensitivity remained, and the gods were satisfied. As the night came, they formed the four women with the same corn paste, also blinding them to the true reality of the universe. And when the men woke up in the morning, they found their new companions, the 8 ancestors, 4 men and 4 women of the Quiche people were born, and they would multiply until one day their descendants would retell this story in the Popol Vuh. As always, in world creation myths, this one provides an explanation for the origin of the world and of humans, with some aspects that remind us of other creation narratives. For example, forming humans with clay or food, the creation of humans happening at the end after the creation of animals, the appearance of land in a world where there was only sea at the beginning, and the creation of women on the model of men once men had been validated. These are elements that appear in different creation narratives from around the world, including the Bible. And as always, the story provides explanations about the place of humans in the world, typically as the last and favorite creation of God or gods, and also the most complicated one, with its flaws and abilities that distinguish us from the animal kingdom. Now, there is not one Mesoamerican mythology, far from that, with its different cultures and thousands of years of independent cultural development before the arrival of Europeans. Mesoamerica, which corresponds to the southern half of Mexico and several countries of Central America, had a wealth of cultures that rose and sometimes fell long before the end of the Pre-Columbian period. The most famous are the Olmecs, the Toltecs, the Maya, and the Aztecs. But there were more, and they had big differences, yet they were in contact. They showed similar levels of technical development and shared many cultural traits. Their aesthetics, their production of crafts, and their works of art, their societies, their vision of the world, their beliefs, and their myths were at the same time different but connected. It is a bit like the Fertile Crescent in the Middle East, another cradle of human civilization. Different cultures and ethnicities that were separate, but also sharing cultural traits that spread to the entire region and came back transformed as cultures and states rose and fell throughout many centuries. So it makes sense to look at Mesoamerican myths as a whole, as long as we bear in mind the distances in space and time between these different cultures. Some narratives circulated, their cosmologies had similarities. And this is why I tell you about Maya and Aztec myths together. Tonight, as I tell you more of these stories, you will notice that some motives come back. For example, the feathered serpent. I just told you about the Maya feathered serpent, Kukulkan, and in a minute we will hear about Quetzalcoatl, the Aztec feathered serpent. This myth lasted for centuries, possibly thousands of years. When the Aztecs rose in the northern part of Mesoamerica in central Mexico, the Maya had long passed their peak as powerful and wealthy city-states. Maya culture had survived the abandonment of these large Maya cities like Palenque, Chichen Itza, or Tikal. But politically and militarily, the Maya had declined so much that they could barely oppose the conquest by Spanish conquistadors when they arrived in the 16th century. This was the time when the Popol Vuh, this text about mythical tales, the history, cosmology, and the gods of the ancient Maya, was composed by the Quiche. These people that belong to the Maya cultural area. The story I just told you is not necessarily the only Maya creation history. It is just one that the Quiche happened to have and compiled in the Popol Vuh. But it is well possible that this is just one tradition, one version of the story, and maybe Maya mythology was way more diverse. We cannot know for sure because lots of writings were lost. They were lost before the Spanish arrived in the south of Mexico, because the Maya had declined centuries earlier, and also after, as the Maya population was converted to Christianity. Most Maya texts were destroyed because they were considered pagan. We do not know to what extent exactly, but part of their body of legends, and maybe historical texts too, were lost like this. So it is a bit like Norse mythology, which I have already told you about in past episodes. We know it through very few sources. In the case of the old Norse mythology stories, these sources are mainly the poetic and the prose Eddas, that are texts written in Iceland at the very end or even after the Old Norse period. And in the case of the Maya, there is the Popol Vuh and a few other texts written in the 16th century, at the time when pre-Columbian cultures of Mexico were being dramatically hit and changed forever by the Spanish conquest. So the Popol Vuh, like the Eddas written in Iceland, are like the late remains of dying worlds, which make them very precious culturally, but they may only contain the tip of an iceberg of narratives and beliefs that has entirely disappeared. So I told you about the diversity of civilizations that rose and fell in Mesoamerica. They were diverse, but also in contact. And a good way to illustrate this is to look at another, different creation myth. This time we're going to travel north to central Mexico, and I'm going to tell you about the myth of the 5 suns, the narratives of the Nahuas, one of the indigenous people of Mexico, to which the Toltecs, the Tlaxcaltecas, or the Mexica, the Aztecs belong. You will recognize specific details that were also part of the Maya myths, and the story goes like this. We think we live in the only world that ever was, but this is not true. We are in the 5th world to ever exist. Before our time, there were 4 different worlds, topped by 4 different suns. And the tumultuous story of these 5 worlds and their 5 suns goes as follows. The world began when the universe was only void, and from this void happened the greatest miracle ever. The first God created himself from nothing, himself or herself, because this first divinity was the God of duality, Ometeotl. Ometeotl was both male and female. It contained all dual principles that would one day become familiar. Life and death, night and day, male and female. Ometeotl could have children alone, and the divinity gave birth to 4 children. The 4 Tezcaltlipocas, who were guardians of the 4 cardinal directions, one each. The guardian of the west was Quetzalcoatl, the white-feathered serpent, god of light, wind, and knowledge. Opposite to him, to the east, was Xipe Totec, the red god of gold, agriculture, and the seasons. The guardian of the southern corner was Huitzilopochtli, the blue god of the sun and war. Finally, to the north was Tezcatlipoca the Black. He was the god of judgment and magic. These 4 gods, these 4 brothers born from Ometeotl, created the world and space between them. And the center of this world was the city of Teotihuacan, meaning the birthplace of the gods. The 4 gods populated this world with other gods that they created, especially Tlaloc, the god of rain and fertility. On the land they had made emerge in the middle of the ocean, they put animals and a race of giants. This world needed light, and for this it needed a sun. One of them had to become a sun. Tezcatlipoca, the black guardian of the north, was chosen to fulfill this role. He transformed into a sun. But maybe because of his dark nature, Tezcatlipoca could only become a half-sun, and the world stayed quite dark. Still, life continued like this for a while, but the other 3 gods were not very satisfied with this dark world. and a sibling rivalry developed between Tezcatlipoca the Black and Quetzalcoatl the White, the feathered serpent of the West. Eventually, Quetzalcoatl decided he had had enough. He took a stone club and hit his brother with it, knocking this half-sun from the sky. Tezcatlipoca was infuriated at having lost his place as the sun, and as revenge, he sent his jaguars to eat all the people of this world. It was only fair to him that if he could not be the sun, no one would live in this now completely dark world. Ravaged by the jaguars of Tezcatlipoca, this world died. And this is how the first world under the first sun disappeared. The time for a second sun had come. The gods created new humans who were smaller, of regular size, and they repopulated the world, ravaged by the wrath of Tezcatlipoca the Black. Now Quetzalcoatl the White, the feathered serpent of the West, served as the new sun, the second sun. Under him, a new civilization developed on Earth. But contrary to his expectations, this new breed of humans failed the gods. Instead of worshiping them and following their teachings, the men became greedy and corrupt. Quetzalcoatl was disappointed. He became lost in his thoughts, and that was the moment Tezcatlipoca the Black waited for. Using his magic, he transformed humans into monkeys. The monkeys dispersed in the wilderness, and Quetzalcoatl accepted this failure by stepping down from his role as the sun in order to craft a new race of humans that would be closer to perfection. And with this ended the reign of Quetzalcoatl as a second sun, leaving once again the world empty of humans. But it was not over. The gods had created new humans and repopulated the world with them. So a new sun, a third one, was now needed. Tlaloc, the god of rain created by the four brothers at the start of the universe, was chosen to be this new sun. But Tezcatlipoca, the Black Guardian of the North, had not been appeased yet, and was still furious for having been knocked off the sky in his role as the first sun. In retaliation, he captured Xochiquetzal, who Tlaloc was in love with, the goddess of beauty and fertility. Tlaloc became so consumed by her disappearance that he no longer fulfilled his role as god of the rain. Now turned into a sun, he warmed the earth, but without rain, a great drought began, and the people of the world went hungry and thirsty. They prayed desperately, but the god was too distracted, and the drought seemed it would last forever. Finally, Tlaloc had a fit of rage one day and sent a rain of fire upon the earth. What remained of vegetation and people was consumed, leaving only ashes in the emerged world. After that, Tlaloc abandoned his role as the sun and went into hiding, overwhelmed by grief. This was how the world was destroyed again, and the age of the third sun ended, leaving only a lifeless, barren land plunged into darkness. Still, the gods did not abandon their idea to create a world. They worked together to create a new earth, fertile again, and life reappeared on it after the devastation caused by Tlaloc. A new sun, the fourth one, was necessary, and this time the choice of the gods went to a goddess, Chalchiutlique, the goddess of water, the sea, and rivers. Chalchiutlique was renowned for her capacity to be tender and loving. She was popular among gods and people, and so she was believed to be a good choice, and indeed, a happy and harmonious period began on earth. Animals lived their lives and multiplied. Humans praised the gods and were generally happy under the warmth and light given by the fourth sun. And the gods finally felt proud of their creation. All the gods save one. Tezcatlipoca the Black was angry and resentful as ever, and couldn't stand to see a happy world under another sun than him. Full of venom, he approached Chalchiutlique and told her that she was not really sweet and loving, that it was just a facade to gain the people's praise. He said to her that deep down she was fake and selfish. Chalchiutlique was so crushed by these mean words that she started crying. Her pain at realizing that such evil was possible, and her doubts about her true nature, were so intense that she couldn't stop crying, and the world under her paid the price for it. As her tears fell and fell on the land, a massive flood overwhelmed the earth for 52 years. Almost everyone drowned on earth, except for a few humans that became fish in order to survive. The gods understood that the water goddess would no longer be fit to be sun, and once again they decided to restart everything. This is how the fourth sun ended, and a new era began, the fifth sun, our era. The new sun would be the blue garden of the south and the god of war, Huitzilopochtli, who also is the god of the sun in our era because he is the sun now. Since Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, had always been the best defender of humans, he didn't accept the new destruction of his people. So he went to the underworld and stole the bones of humans from the god of death, after which he dipped the bones in his own blood to resurrect humans. When they opened their eyes, humans found this new sun, this new world, and they praised Quetzalcoatl for his miracle. But as humans repopulated the earth, another conflict was about to burst in the sky this time. Huitzilopochtli was not the only deity living in the sky. Far from that. There were plenty of lesser gods and goddesses hidden by his light. These deities became jealous of the fifth sun, and they organized behind the goddess of the moon that led them in an assault on the sun, on Huitzilopochtli. And so began a war in the sky that is still ongoing. When we see Huitzilopochtli dominate, His light is everywhere, and we call this the day. But regularly, the other deities attack again and come close to beating him. This is the night, when the light vanishes and the moon and all the other deities of the sky, the stars, become visible. We have to pray that Huitzilopochtli will never lose this fight, because if his light disappears and the world is plunged into constant darkness, if the fifth sun is vanquished from the sky, our world will also end like the four worlds before. For this reason, men do sacrifices to Huitzilopochtli. Sacrifices are nourishment to the sun, to help in its fight and to ensure that daylight returns. Another threat is the existence of Tezcatlipoca, the vengeful black guardian of the north, who was responsible for the end of several suns before ours. He also must be appeased with sacrifices. And finally, in honor of Quetzalcoatl, the serpent, a more benevolent figure, humans spill some of their blood, sometimes as a gift to show gratitude to the God that brought our kind back to life in this world. So, this is the story of the world, and these are the reasons why we must stay humble to the gods and offer sacrifices to fortify Huitzilopochtli and to appease Tezcatlipoca, because if we don't, may well come to an end. This mythical narrative has plenty of variations. That was just one Aztec version among others. It is likely that in the Pre-Columbian period, there were variants of the same myth across the various Nahuatl-speaking peoples. So, what do these terms mean? Nahuatl, Mexica, Aztec? They are different things. Nahuatl is a language, or a group of related languages that was spoken in central Mexico. It appeared, at least in the 7th century AD. Even though Spanish is by far the main language in modern Mexico, Nahuatl has not disappeared and still has around 1.7 million native speakers today, most of them still living in central Mexico. Now, Nahuatl was the language of the Mexica, and the Mexica are a people who lived essentially in the Valley of Mexico in pre-Columbian times. Aztec is a word that is a bit imprecise, because it can refer at the same time to a civilization, a state, the Aztec Empire, or sometimes to a people. These people, being the Mexica, but not all the Mexica, were part of the Aztec Empire, at least at the beginning, before they were subjugated. Initially, this famous Aztec Empire was an alliance of 3 Mexica city-states, Tenochtitlan, which was located at the center of what is now Mexico City, built on an island on a lake which has now disappeared under the capital of Mexico and its more than 20 million inhabitants. And the other 2 cities were Texcoco and Tlacopan. This triple alliance conquered much of central Mexico. It expanded well beyond the valley where it had originated, with a mix of war and diplomacy. So the Aztecs subjugated various other peoples, turning them into kinds of vassals with what seems to have been a lot of brutality. When the Spanish arrived in Mexico in the 16th century, one of the reasons for their successful conquest of the Aztecs was the revolt of these peoples against their former masters, which dislocated the Aztec Empire. Now, Aztec is also the name of a civilization, one of several from Mesoamerica, because even though the Aztec Empire emerged only a century before the Spanish conquest, it was relatively short-lived. It covered a cultural area in central Mexico with a specific culture that carried the legacy of previous cultures, but forming a powerful, coherent state for decades. This is why this Nahuatl-speaking and Mexica-dominated empire of the Aztecs is also called a civilization. What we call Aztec mythology is in fact the body of myths of several groups of Mexica ethnicity and Nahuatl language. We already named some of their main gods and goddesses in the story of the five sons, but the complexity of their pantheon went well beyond that. One thing that can be confusing for people who know more about Middle Eastern and Mediterranean antique pantheons, Egypt, Greece, Rome, is that the Aztec gods had areas that they were responsible for, concepts attached to their names like war, sun, fire, rain, death, which is familiar. But there were several of them for each concept, with subtle variations, and sometimes different gods were in charge of the same thing. For example, there were several water deities. I told you about Tlaloc, the god of falling water, rain, and also lightning and thunder. Tlaloc, together with Huitzilopochtli, reportedly the god of war and the fifth sun, as we have seen, were two of the most popular gods of the Aztecs. They had huge monuments, huge pyramids at the center of the capital, Tenochtitlan. Apart from Tlaloc, another deity of water was Chalchutlicue, the fourth sun, the goddess of horizontal water, streams, rivers, lakes, and seas. And there were more. Another water god was Atlawa, who was apparently revered by fishermen, but not alone. There was a second god of fishing and bird catching, also a god of water called Opochitli. There are even more gods of the sky, more than a dozen main ones that are identified separately, including the four guardians of the cardinal directions. There was a god of the sun, Tonatiuh, which was about the concept of sun, whereas the actual sun was the god Huitzilopochtli, as we have seen. Another characteristic of the Aztec pantheon is that it seems to have been in constant evolution. When new peoples were conquered, their beliefs were not eliminated or even rejected. They were allowed to go on with their rituals and deities, which would sometimes be added to the Aztec pantheon and venerated in the capital. For example, the god Xipetotec, which was one of the four guardians in the story of the five sons, the deity of the east associated with the color red, was initially a god of another people, the Tlapanecas. And obviously, as the Aztecs were a late civilization in Mesoamerica, emerging after thousands of years of culture, they inherited beliefs from before that were widespread in the entire region. As I mentioned before, The feathered serpent Quetzalcoatl is in fact a figure that appeared across the entire Mesoamerica, beyond the differences in languages and ethnicities. It is an equivalent to the Maya feathered serpent Kukulkan, the same from the villain Tezcatlipoca, the god of the north, which appears as an antagonist opposed to the more benevolent Quetzalcoatl, Quetzalcoatl being the bringer of life for mankind, whereas Tezcatlipoca is the destructor or the one that schemes to cause destruction. Other Mesoamerican pantheons had an equivalent to this malevolent or evil figure, with similar attributes that show the circulation of cultural traits from the Maya region all the way north to central Mexico, and probably even beyond. After the conquest, quickly came the time of conversion to Christianity, and all natives were invited to abandon their old beliefs, to embrace Catholicism. When I say invited, I mean forced. That was the kind of invitation they could not really refuse. It was enforced, sometimes brutally, when needed. And this was the time when a lot of Aztec and other pre-Columbian documents were destroyed because they were considered pagan, and the belief system they represented, not just the gods, but the entire cosmology, had to be suppressed. But even though Mexico became overwhelmingly Christian, all the beliefs did not die, did not fully disappear. Either they were kept alive secretly, or more often, they mixed with Christianity. That is to say, there was syncretism, the mix of religious traditions into new ones. An example of possible syncretism and this mixing of traditions in Mexico is the Day of the Dead, El Día de los Muertos. You have certainly seen the iconography attributed to it, with the skulls or people painting their faces to look like skulls. This is a traditional celebration in Mexico on the 1st and 2nd of November. The 1st of November being obviously the Christian All Saints' Day. Why this specific Mexican tradition with the skulls and the skeletons? It is believed because El Día de Muertos is the merger of Christian and pre-Hispanic celebrations. The Aztecs also celebrated the dead and had gods of the dead represented with the symbol of bones and skulls. Now, things are never that straightforward, and scholars do not necessarily agree on what is pre-Columbian and what is European or Christian in this celebration. The way the Dia de Muertos is celebrated also reminds one of a medieval European motive called the Danse Macabre. You've probably seen it too. Danse Macabre is one of these scenes with skeletons dancing around graves. It's a kind of allegory on the universality and the unavoidability of death, basically telling that for all of us, rich or poor, weak or powerful, happy or unhappy, death is at the end of the road in this world, and we are all equals before it. So, are the Mexican skulls more of Aztec or European origin? It is hard to say for sure, but this way of celebrating the Dia de Muertos and this iconography are present in Mexico and not in other Latin American countries. So the Mesoamerican heritage seems to have mattered in this somewhat. What is certain, anyway, is that the worshipping of pre-Columbian deities never fully disappeared. It went into hiding. And here, another illustration is the increased visibility and following in the past few decades of a Mexican religious movement called Santa Muerte, or Nuestra Señora de la Santa Muerte, Our Lady of Holy Death. This cult worships a personification of death, Santa Muerte, represented as a female skeleton in a long robe adorned with flowers, jewels, often a crown and a globe. It seems this cult has become increasingly prominent, despite condemnations by the Catholic Church and different Protestant pastors. Condemnation for being a pagan form of idolatry, for a figure that mainstream Christian traditions do not recognize. But religious considerations aside, what is interesting culturally and ethnographically is that the entire iconography of Santa Muerte obviously mixes Christian elements. The way the figure is represented is inspired by the depiction of saints or the Virgin Mary in Catholic images and paintings. So there is this Christian inspiration together with pagan elements, and by pagan I mean Aztec or Pre-Columbian. The Aztecs had a goddess of death called Mictecacihuatl, one of several deities of death, and she was also represented as a skeletal figure together with her husband, the god of death too. They ruled over the lowest level of the Aztec underworld. So she was a representation of extreme death, ultimate death, the kind of state you don't come back from. It seems Mictecacihuatl was a popular figure before the arrival of the Spanish because we have representations of her. That's how we know she was pictured as a skeleton, and because her cult survived Christianization, it could never be eradicated. The secret persistence of her cult is assumed because regularly the figure of a skeletal female goddess reappeared along the centuries. This is documented in the 18th, 19th, and early 20th centuries. Now, was it an underground movement that sporadically became visible? Or was it reinvented several times by people who wanted to rediscover and reappropriate the native heritage? It is hard to tell. What is clear is that there is direct inspiration from this Aztec goddess in the modern figure of Santa Muerte. And this is not a marginal movement. The number of followers of this cult, maybe some more casually than others, and many may understand Santa Muerte more as a Catholic saint than a pagan goddess, but still, the number of followers is estimated to be more than 10 million people nowadays, mostly in Mexico. We have spoken of creation myths, of the cosmology they described and different gods. This is not exhaustive at all. It is just a quick look at a large and abundant region of the world when it comes to ancient cultural and mythological traditions. But Mesoamerica also had heroes, and to conclude this overview, we are going to go back south to Maya country and discover the story of the hero twins that defied and ultimately vanquish the gods of death in the underworld. You remember that in our first story, the Quiche Maya myth of creation, the gods had formed men from corn, from maize. This is revealing of the importance of corn, which was the base cereal of the Maya and across Mesoamerica. It was the most important crop, so they had a maize god, Unapu. But what was his origin story? Once upon a time, there were two sons that were twins, Unapu and Ixbalanque. The two twins turned out to be very good at the traditional ball game, which consisted of throwing a ball through a vertical ring attached to a wall, only using elbows and knees. But the two brothers used to play on a court that was just above the place where the gods of death lived, in Xibalba, the underworld. These 12 gods, the lords of Xibalba, ruled over death, and each of them had a domain: sickness, fear, pain. All that could make living creatures suffered was governed by them, and so they were feared and disliked. No person in their right mind would have ever descended to Xibalba, where countless traps and other dangers would await them. Unfortunately for the two twins, the gods of Xibalba had been annoyed by the noise they made when they played just above them, and they tricked the twins. They invited them to come play the ball game down in their world. When the twins descended, they were captured and killed. That was one story more to add to the long list of bad things that the 12 gods of Xibalba had done. But the story did not end there. When Unapu was not completely dead, his head, which had been severed, could still talk. And one day, the head was found by a princess who talked to it. Such was the power and the fertility of Unapu that she became pregnant. The princess gave birth to twins, and they were educated in the memory of their father and knew what had happened to him. They also turned out to be gifted at the ball game, and they played on the court where their father and their uncle had once played, just above the home of the 12 gods of Xibalba. Once again, the gods heard the noise they made. They were annoyed, and they invited them to come play in Xibalba. The gods had all sorts of traps in their realm: a river of blood, another one full of scorpions, holes in the ground, and if by chance visitors survived all this, they would defeat them on the ball game court and take their lives as a price of their defeat. But the two twins knew better than throwing themselves into this obvious trap, and instead of naively accepting the invitation like their father, they sent a mosquito down to Xibalba to spy on the evil gods and their traps. The mosquito returned and told them everything so that they arrived prepared. They avoided all the traps, and it came down to the ball game in the ball game court of Xibalba. And there, the two twins turned out to be so good that they defeated the evil gods playing against them, the same two gods that had killed their father years earlier. They killed two evil gods, and because of that, they could bring back their father, coming back to life. When Hunahpu had completed the first of many cycles, he had died, disappeared underground, and come back to life. He became the god of maize, and the very same material our kind was formed with. Just like corn, we appear, we grow, we die, and we disappear, but never fully via our offspring. Part of us reappears, grows, lives, dies, and so on, in a succession of cycles that will last as long as the gods allow our world to exist. There was a time when light did not exist. In the beginning, the world was covered in darkness. There was no sun and no day. The perpetually dark sky had no moon or stars. In this dark world, all manner of beasts and birds prospered. Among the beasts were many hideous monsters that did not even have names, as well as the ancestors of beasts that still populate our world: wolves, bears, foxes, and also much smaller beasts like beavers, rabbits, squirrels, rats, and mice. And on top of that, all sorts of creeping creatures such as lizards and snakes. There were humans too, but very few because they could not thrive in this world. The beasts destroyed their offspring and denied them access to the land. And so humans lived in fear, in caves that were even darker than the outside. The birds were not as ferocious and dangerous as the beasts, and as more elevated beings, they were organized. They held councils and they obeyed their chief, the eagle. In these ancient times, both birds and beasts had the power of speech, and for eons, the world stayed like this. The birds dominated in the dark sky, the beasts dominated on the dark earth, and a few humans survived, living in terror of being found and eaten. And one day, it happened that the birds became curious about what the world would be if there was light in it. They wanted light admitted, and so they sent an embassy to the beasts to discuss the transformation of the world, the replacement of darkness with light. The beasts liked the world as it was, and they refused. The agreement of birds and beasts was needed for the light to be invited, and because they could not obtain it by diplomacy, the birds resorted to war. They declared war on the beasts. The beasts were stronger. Some were enormous and apparently invincible, and others were tiny. They could hide and attack by surprise. But the eagle armed the birds with bows and arrows so that they could attack at a distance, and they could also escape by flying. Or they could drop stones from above onto the heads of the bigger beasts. After many days of ferocious and uncertain fighting, the birds prevailed. Once the surviving beasts had accepted defeat in this war, they saw many of them disappear forever. The birds could impose their decision. The light was admitted to the world, and all creatures, the birds, the beasts that had survived, and humans who emerged from their caves for the first time. They all saw the beauty of nature and marveled at the world they lived in. Mankind could finally live in the open, and it began to prosper. But men did not forget they owed their newfound freedom to the birds, and especially their chief, the eagle. They started wearing his feathers as emblems of wisdom, justice, and power. Among human beings who lived during this era of access to the illuminated world, there was a woman who had many children. But none of them had survived because they had been taken by the beasts. Mankind could now inhabit the surface, but men remained prey to the remaining wolves, bears, serpents, and the most feared of all beasts, the dragon. One day this woman had another son, and she refused to lose him like she had lost the others. So she dug a cave deep in the ground to conceal her baby. And she closed the entrance and built a campfire over the spot so that her son would be kept warm and hidden from the beasts, especially from the dragon, who was very evil but also astute and constantly hungry. Every day she would remove the fire and descend into the cave to nurse her child. Then she would return to the surface and rebuild the campfire. The dragon was suspicious and always on the hunt for human children. He would frequently come and question her, asking where her children were. The only reason he did not eat her was that she could produce more babies. But the woman was brave, and despite the terror of the dragon, she never revealed the existence of her son, always swearing that she had no more children and that the dragon had already eaten all of them. Thanks to her efforts, the child could grow in his cave for several years. Her son kept growing, turning from toddler to child to adolescent. But it happened one day that the dragon saw his tracks, and this enraged the monster because he could not find the place where the boy was hidden. He threatened to kill the mother if she didn't reveal where her son was. But the woman again refused to give up her child. She decided he would no longer be allowed to go out of his cave out of fear she would lose him like the others. When she descended into the cave and told her son, the boy refused to stay underground forever, and he said that instead he would go hunting. There was no stopping him. He told his mother that living in hiding and afraid was not living, and that come what may, he would go out into the wilderness and live and breathe the air and enjoy the light. She argued that outside there were wolves, the bears, the serpents, and even worse, the dragon, which was already looking for him. But his decision was made. On the following day, he asked his uncle, one of the few men who populated the earth at the time, to accompany him and give him weapons so that he could hunt. The uncle made a little bow and some arrows for the boy, and the two went hunting. They found the tracks of a deer and followed them across the plain, across the river, through canyons, and finally up a mountain until they found him. Here they found their prey. The boy took his little bow and shot. This was his first success as a hunter, and they rejoiced. His uncle showed him how to prepare and cook the meat on a fire. But as they were preparing their meal, the huge form of the dragon suddenly appeared. The most feared, the most terrifying of all beasts that never let prey escape, had finally found them. The uncle was petrified, but maybe due to his natural bravery or his innocence, the boy was not afraid. The dragon could have eaten him on the spot, but instead, after all those years of looking for this particular boy that he had found for the first time, the dragon decided to take his time and enjoy his triumph. The dragon took the meat they were preparing and declared that he would eat the meat and then the boy. But instead of being terrified and begging for his life, as humans usually did, the boy walked to the dragon, took back the meat, and declared that this was his, and that the dragon would certainly not eat him or his uncle. The dragon was astonished at this bravery or foolishness. He didn't know which one it was. He thought the boy was probably mad. He retook the meat, but so did the boy. 4 times the piece of meat changed hands. Finally, the boy asked the dragon if he would fight him. The monster laughed and said yes, in whatever way the little man would like. The dragon was huge and protected by 4 coats of horn. Nothing would hurt such a monster, so he didn't worry at all that he could be defeated. The boy offered the following duel rules. They would stand at 100 steps from each other, and the dragon would be allowed to shoot 4 times at the boy with its enormous bow and arrows. If the boy survived, they would exchange places, and the little man would have 4 shots at the dragon. The dragon laughed and accepted this little game that he couldn't lose. He took his bow, which was made of an entire pine tree, and his quiver of arrows. Each of the arrows was a pine tree sapling, and they were 20 feet long. The dragon took aim and soon learned that the boy was small and quick. He could avoid the deadly arrow once, twice, 3 times, and finally 4 times. Then the boy said it was now his turn to shoot. The dragon was mildly annoyed that the boy was still alive, but the rules were the rules, so they exchanged places. With its 4 coats of horn, there was no risk at all that the small arrow could even scratch his skin. Hitting the huge dragon was easy, but the boy knew that his little arrows were no match for this huge armored enemy unless he could shoot just at the right place, near the heart and between the scales. He shot the first arrow that landed exactly where he intended, near the heart, and the dragon's outer coat of horn fell to the ground. Then the second shot destroyed the second coat, and a third also hit its target. The dragon was now trembling because, should the fourth shot hit again, it would pierce his heart, and the tiny human would win. Dragons were evil, but they were still bound by their word, and the monster was now at the boy's mercy. The boy shot the fourth time, and the arrow pierced the dragon's heart. With a tremendous roar, the dragon rolled down the mountainside into the canyon below. The order of nature had suddenly changed. A tiny human with agility and precision had defeated the most powerful of beasts. Storm clouds swept the mountain. Lightning flashed, thunder roared, and the rain poured. The world would never be the same again. The age of humans was beginning. This boy's name was Apache, and he was destined to become the first chief of men. Our next story is a creation myth of the Kiowa Apache from the Southern Plains. It does not necessarily connect to the first story because it is one of multiple traditions and storylines that exist among the Apache bands or tribes. Here is the story of Kuterastan, the creator. His name means one who lives above. In the beginning, before there was earth or sky, or even longer before there were plains or forests and mountains and deserts, and also long before there were winds, rain, rivers, and lakes, there was only darkness. Until one moment when in the darkness appeared a small and thin disk, and inside this disk was a small bearded man, no larger than a frog. Kuterastan, that was his name. He was without past. He didn't even know the concept of time, but he was a creative force called into existence to shape the world from his tiny disk. After he awakened and rubbed his eyes, he looked above him into the infinite darkness, and by the powers that he had, the darkness above filled with light and illuminated the darkness below, separating this world into two halves, above and below the disk. Then he rubbed his eyes again and looked to the east. The eastern night took the yellow color of dawn, and after that he looked west. The western night was immediately shaded by the power of his look with the amber tones of dusk. As he danced around himself, clouds of different colors appeared. Then again, Kuterastan rubbed his eyes and face. As he flung the sweat from his hands, a very small cloud appeared, with a tiny little girl, even smaller than him, on top of it. Her name was Stenatlia, which means the woman without parents. Kuterastan and Stenatlia started talking, and for the first time, words were spoken in this world that was still dressed in light above and darkness below. Yellow light in the east and amber light in the west, and a few clouds around them. The two spoke, puzzled about the question of who they were, where they came from, and wondering what this world was and what was going to happen, unaware that they would be the source of what was going to happen to the world. After thinking for some time, again, Kuterastan rubbed his eyes and face and then rubbed his hands together. When he opened them, his sweat flew and two new beings appeared from it. The first one was Chugana'ai, the sun, and the second, Hadintinskin, meaning pollen boy. The two new entities were as puzzled and ignorant of the primordial energy they embodied as Kuterastan and Stenatliha were. The four of them sat a long time in silence on a cloud, meditating. Again, Kuterastan broke the silence and asked what they should do to make this existence, this world, more habitable and filled with meaning. The purpose was emerging, the creation of the world. The four of them, whom humans would later call gods, started this creation by giving birth to more entities. Led by Kuterastan, the four created Nacholecho, the tarantula, who would weave and help them. They made the Big Dipper, who stood next to them, and then the wind, lightning, and thunder. Each was given characteristic tasks that made the world richer, more alive, and more wonderful. But however entertaining this creation was, they still lived on the ground they grew bored of. It was a poor home. So they turned their attention to making an earth that would be a much more suitable place to inhabit for them, their creations, and the ones to come, too. The four gods mixed their sweat in Kuterastan's palms. He rubbed his hands again, and a small brown ball emerged from them. It was no bigger than a bean, but like the tiniest of seeds that can give birth to giant trees, this smooth ball was just the beginning. The gods expanded the ball by kicking it, and then they let the wind inside it to inflate it. The earth grew bigger and bigger, much, much bigger than the gods who created it. Nacholecho, the tarantula, attached the black cord to the ball and pulled it far to the east where the yellow light of dawn shined. Then a blue cord was pulled to the south, a yellow cord to the west, and a white cord to the north. All were pulled to these 4 points, and the earth expanded again, becoming a vast expanse of smooth brown plains. When the tarantula god was finished, Kuterastan had poles placed at each corner to hold the earth in place, allowing the world to sit still. The gods had begun to sing as they created, and the joy of seeing the world take shape in all the ways they imagined inspired their songs, which in return also shaped the world. The creation also sprang from songs that the gods invented. Each new thing came with a new song. After the earth had been stretched and made to sit still, Kuterastan began another song referring to the sky. He felt there ought to be one to embrace the earth, and 4 times he chanted this new sky song. At the end of the 4th time, he spread his hands wide before him, and the sky appeared, embracing earth in every direction. On Earth, the landscape was being shaped by winds, waters running through the plains, by the creativity of the four gods and their offspring. They all contributed to shape this new world with songs and dances. One day, the lightning maker, one of Kuterastan's children, returned with 3 beings that he had found in the sky. These were just shapes, 2 girls and a boy, with limbs like gods, but no eyes, ears, hair, mouth, nose, or teeth. Though they had arms and legs, they lacked fingers and toes. They were like an unfinished draft, resembling the shape of the gods. Maybe they had accidentally appeared from one of their creation works, or another entity had put them there. This was, is, and will remain a mystery. Enthusiastically, the 4 gods decided to finish them, which would require a lot of sweat and inspiration. They had a sweat house built on Earth, and they closed it with clouds. When they had enough sweat, the woman without parents, Stenatliha, used it to shape the beings. She made them fingers and toes, mouth and eyes and ears, hair and nose. When she was done, Kuterastan welcomed them to creation. The boy was made Sky Boy, chief of the sky and its people. The first girl was made Earth Daughter and placed in charge of the earth and its crops. The second girl was called Pollen Girl and assigned the care of the health of the earth people. The earth could now be populated, and new songs began from all these voices. The first gods and their offspring sang, creating all sorts of animals on earth, in the rivers and the lakes, birds in the sky, and in the last creation song, women and men, their children. These first 2 creation stories are just 2 of many more myths and legends that were transmitted for generations within Apache tribes. But who are the Apache? They are not a single people, but a quite large group of different bands and tribes. Not that large by population. There would be a bit more than 100,000 individuals in this group nowadays, but large by the area where they used to live in the southern United States, and large by their number of communities of bands and tribes. Chiricahua, Jicarilla, Lipan, Mezcalero, Salinero, Aravaipa, Pinaleño, and there are more. There are all different tribes that lived and still live from Texas and Oklahoma to Arizona. People from these tribes have also migrated to cities all across the United States, especially in the 20th century, and some live abroad. But this is still where many Apache live, and especially those most connected to their ancestral culture. So why do these different tribes form a larger group? Because they are culturally and historically related. They share the same language group called the Apachean, or Southern Athabascan group. Athabascan is a large family of indigenous languages in North America that extends far beyond the American Southwest. It is also present in Alaska, in Western Canada, on the Pacific coast of the United States, in Oregon and Northern California, and in the Southwest, including in the north of Mexico. It doesn't mean that speakers of these many languages that belong to the Athabascan family can't understand each other, but the languages they speak have a common origin, possibly a single common ancestor language, and over centuries of migrations and cultural exchange with other groups, growing distances between speakers caused these languages to form, and they keep changing when they are still spoken. That is what languages do. It is not known precisely when the Apache populated the American Southwest. Their arrival is estimated to be sometime between 800 and 500 years ago. Long before they arrived, there were other Native American peoples in the Southwest, some of whom had a sedentary lifestyle. They built many villages and left plenty of archaeological remains that could be dated. For example, in a previous story I told you about Mesa Verde, a dwelling in Colorado left by the ancestral Pueblo culture. But the Apache were mostly nomads, and it is believed that they originated from regions that are now in Canada. This fits with the presence of the Athabascan language family up north in Canada and as far as Alaska. Actually, this group that would have migrated to the south, reaching regions of plains, deserts, and mountains that were very different from the places they came from. This group, or this migration wave, would have spread over several American states. And there would have been variances. Another major cultural group born from the same migration became a neighbor to the Apache in the eastern neighborhood, the Navajo. Culturally, they are distinct enough that overall the Navajo adopted a more settled lifestyle, planting crops and practicing herding, whereas more Apache lived a nomadic life. But that was not systematic. The Apache had different types of housing. In the plains, teepees were common, that is to say, conical tents made with wooden poles and animal skins. In the highlands, they built wickiups or wigwams, which are domed dwellings that are semi-permanent. They could be used for a longer time and were not made to be disassembled and transported like teepees. In the desert of northern Mexico, they built hogans, which are earthen structures that are also typical of the Navajo. These regions where they arrived were not empty. They found other peoples there. We don't know exactly what happened then, if they fought, forced by others to leave, if they mixed with existing populations, or maybe a bit of all of this. By the end of the 16th century at the latest, possibly before, they were established in the American Southwest region and the north of Mexico. They shared this very large space with other peoples, like the Pueblo peoples, whom they traded with. Both Apache and Navajo were not affected by the first decades of European colonization in America, as they were too far away. The first contact and clashes happened in the 17th century, initially with the Spaniards who came from Mexico, and on a much larger scale in the 19th century with the United States, which was expanding to the west at the time. Intermittent war occurred between Apache bands and the U.S. Army between 1849 and 1886, almost 40 years. The most famous figure of this conflict was Goyankla, also known as Geronimo, who was a leader and medicine man, a healer and a spiritual leader. He rose to fame because he participated in many raids over more than 30 years against interests and troops of Mexico and the United States. The Apache had been confined to reservations after the United States took possession of this region following the war against Mexico. And these reservations no longer permitted them to live the kind of free-moving lifestyle that was their customary way of life. So, over the years, hundreds of Apache joined Geronimo in breakouts from the reservation to launch raids. Though never on a very large scale, at any time he commanded only a few dozen men, but for a long time he tried to keep the flame of independence alive for the people who had been displaced and forced to live in reservations much smaller than their traditional territories. He was finally taken prisoner in 1886 and spent the rest of his life as such, not in a cell but under watch, until his death in 1909. His capture in 1886 is generally considered to be the end of the Apache conflict. After that, the intensity of raids was much less, but still, it wasn't until the 1920s that the cycle of raids and counter-raids involving the Apache finally ended. The Navajo were cultural cousins of the Apache. Though they are different cultures and societies, they settled in the same regions and their languages have common roots. There are more than 400,000 Navajo, and they have a creation myth called the Dine Bahane, literally the story of the people. Navajo call themselves the Dine, the people, and their story is extraordinary. So let's explore the story of the Dineta, the homeland, which is where the Navajo live, but not the only world to have ever existed. Our world is actually the fourth and final world, and many things happened before the first human arrived here, many, many generations ago. It all began with the first world. First world was small and simple. It was entirely black and made of 4 different seas. Where the seas met, there was a single island where a single pine tree grew. The only inhabitants of this first world were the air spirit people, ants, beetles, dragonflies, locusts, and bats. No one ever knew whether this world existed for an eternity or maybe just a heartbeat. But it happened that a cloud formed above each of the 4 seas. There was a black cloud, a white cloud, a yellow cloud, and a blue cloud, and the wind began to blow. The blue and yellow clouds came together in the west, and as they mixed, first woman was formed. At the same time, the black and white clouds came together in the east, and they mixed. First man appeared. Each of them had appeared with a stone. From the blue and yellow clouds, the turquoise formed, and it was owned by the woman. From the white and black clouds, a crystal had also formed, and it was owned by the man. Using their stones, each of them made a fire in their respective corner of this small, dark world, and for the first time, light appeared. This light was the awakening of the mind. For the first time, this dark world, thoughts and feelings came into existence. As the clouds rose higher in the sky, first man and first woman saw each other's fires in the distance. They were intrigued and searched for each other. Guided by their light, and they met. They decided to stay together in this world where everything complemented something else. But this harmony didn't last. Another being, Great Coyote, formed in the water of the four seas and appeared near them. He declared that he knew everything that was under the water and in the sky, and that he owned the knowledge. And yet a fourth being soon appeared, another coyote named First Angry, who declared he was older than the other three and knew witchcraft. The four of them began to argue, bringing disharmony into the world. Like a plague, disharmony extended to the air spirit people, the ants, the beetles, the dragonflies, the locusts, and the bats. They also became jealous of each other and began to fight. The island at the center of the four seas had turned to chaos and war. The spirits of the forces could stand it no more and demanded all these beings to leave their world. There was an opening in the sky in the east, and flying or climbing, all the inhabitants of the first world escaped. They crawled through the passage in the sky and left the first world, the dark world, forever. The insects, the man, the woman, and the two coyotes entered the second world. The second world was as blue as the first was dark. The newcomers began to explore it, and they found blue plains, blue rivers, and blue mountains. Finally, they found the inhabitants. There were bluebirds and blue hawks, blue jays, and many blue furry animals. The masters of the second world were the swallow people, all birds who welcomed the newcomers to share their world, where harmony ruled. It was decided that air spirit people and swallow people would live together as a single tribe. First man, first woman, and the two coyotes were also allowed to stay with them. For 23 days they all lived together and treated each other as members of the same tribe. But on the 24th day, one of the air spirit people approached the wife of the swallow people's chief and asked to sleep with her. The wife accepted, and on the following day, her husband found out. He complained that the foreigners had been treated as equals and with kindness, but had been ungrateful and treacherous. Even though they had been given a second chance, these air spirit people were still not living in balance and harmony, and so they had to leave this world. Like in the first world, signs appeared, fights ensued, and the offended swallow chief demanded all that did not belong to this world to leave it. There was an opening in the sky to the south, and the air spirit people, the man, the woman, the coyotes, and the blue beings who disagreed passed through it. They went into the third world. The third world was as yellow as the second world was blue. The third world teemed with life. There were animals they had never seen before, like antelopes and deer, turkeys and squirrels. It also had two rivers that crossed in its center, and in its corners were sacred mountains. In the east was White Dawn Mountain, in the south was Blue Turquoise Mountain, and there were also Yellow Mountain and Black Mountain. On these mountains lived 4 holy people who were immortal, one on each mountain. The third world was welcoming, and the refugees from the first and second world settled there, happy for this new opportunity to begin a new life. First man and first woman built their home and settled near the place where the rivers crossed. The 4 holy people tolerated the newcomers into their world, and one day they visited the man and woman. They asked them to cleanse themselves because they would soon return. The 2 obeyed and bathed carefully. When holy people returned, they performed a ritual that transformed first man and first woman. Until then, they had been spirit people who were born from nature in the first world. They were, in essence, a potential that had not yet taken material shape. The ritual transformed them into human beings with great powers. The holy people instructed them to live as husband and wife, to explore their new flesh and reproduce, and they did. The man and the woman had several pairs of twins, and time passed in the third world. They learned weaving from 2 creatures that also lived near the crossing of the rivers, Spider Woman and Spider Man. Their children and then their children's children formed a village where they all lived in balance and harmony. Until one day, when First Woman complained that while men went hunting and making tools, women did all the work. They gathered the food and tended to the fields. They could live without men for sure. First Man grew angry and called all the other men. He told them that the women thought they could live without them and that it was time to show them they would be miserable without men. And so the men decided to leave and live on the other side of the river, with everything they had invented and made, the axes and hoes. For 4 years, men and women lived separately and grew increasingly unhappy. Each side survived, but they had less food and more work to do. The men lacked new clothes, and the women missed meat. They all longed for each other. A reconciliation finally happened between First Man and First Woman, and the 2 sides reunited. All women had crossed on the raft, except for a mother and her 2 daughters who tried to cross by swimming. But the spirit of the river captured them and took them to their house in the waters, where they would keep company to his own children. The humans soon realized that the 2 girls were missing, and they began to look for them. After a long search which gave no results, they concluded that these girls must be kept prisoner under the river. And so they swam there to retrieve them. Under the waters they found the house of the spirit of the river and the girls inside. But they were accompanied by First Angry the coyote, who had introduced anger and witchcraft to the world. First Angry took the children of the spirit of the river with him, stealing them. The men didn't know that, and they began celebrating because the lost girls were returned. But on the following day, when they all woke up, they saw all sorts of animals running in panic in every direction. The black insects and bats from the first world, the bluebirds and fairy animals of the second world, and the antelopes, the deer, and the squirrels from the third world. They announced that a wall of water was coming from all corners of the world. The wrath of the river spirit would soon submerge the yellow world under a flood. They all ran to the mountains where the holy people lived to ask for help. One of them, Turquoise Boy on the Blue Mountain, gave First Man a reed and told him to plant it, and so it was done. The reed was planted on the top of the mountain, and it grew quickly to the sky where there was an opening. All people from the three worlds, humans and the holy people, climbed to escape the tide that would soon submerge everything, and they arrived in the fourth world, the white world. The refugees had arrived in the middle of a lake in a world populated by beasts. They arrived in this world with all the experience and knowledge they had acquired in the previous worlds. It was decided that this new world would be shaped by the holy people and First Man and First Woman. They would recreate the mountains from the third world with soil and add the colors they had known along their journey. In this world, they would also add the sun, the moon, the stars, and the seasons, modeling the white world into the world we know today. But it wasn't only wisdom and balance they had brought with them. First Angry, the coyote, had crossed to the fourth world too, and they ran into problems because of him. First Angry resented the men and the holy people for not including him in their plans. And so, with the jealous and chaotic nature he was born with, he tried to derail their plans. The truth was that no one trusted him, so he was not informed of their projects for the world. This is why he decided to ruin them as much as he could. When the patterns of the sun, the moon, the night, the sky, and the seasons had been designed, they were perfectly harmonious. Day and night would mark the time for work, life, rest, and sleep. The seasons would indicate when to plant food and harvest. The harmony of celestial bodies would keep harmony, like a mirror between beings in the world. The coyote could not destroy all this creation, but he could spoil it. He disrupted the path of the sun and the path of the moon, so that instead of being synchronized, the 12 months of the sun would be 13 months of the moon. He disrupted the seasons so that sometimes frost would come early and sometimes remain late. Sometimes the rains would come and other times they would not. And all the creatures of the world would be at the mercy of whimsical weather. There would never be absolute peace, certainty, and harmony in human lives. Their harvests would never be guaranteed. Coyote was also responsible for the fact that true death came into existence into the world. One day he threw a stone into a lake and declared that if it sank, then the dead would go back to the previous world and never exist again in our world. Of course, the stone sank, and death became the fate of every living being. The people were mad at him for what he had done, and they went to find him with the intention to beat him. But he spoke and said that he had actually saved the world because it would soon have been overpopulated and unlivable if no one ever disappeared. It was only fair that generations would not exist all at the same time. The people had to admit that there was some wisdom in this, and they understood that the world could not be just fixed and perfectly still and in harmony. Otherwise, there could be no life. Instability, unpredictability, and even death were maybe part of a greater balance. And of this greater balance that made our world, first angry the coyote, that some would be inclined to call evil or chaos, maybe was a necessary part. Once humanity and the creatures from all the four worlds that had lived in the fourth world had settled, the time when history would begin had arrived. It was not the end of wonders or heroes. There would be monsters to slay and new extraordinary creatures to see the light of day. There would be times of exile, cold, poverty, and hunger. The history of the Navajo, the history of the people, was ready to begin. Tonight, I take you on a new journey, and this time we're going to travel to the long lost trails of the Andes Mountains, to jungles, to deserts, to the shores of mountain lakes with crystal clear waters. For thousands of years, human civilizations have risen, declined, transformed, or vanished. In South America, many cities and states flourished, leaving behind countless remains, some of which may still await discovery. But as far as we know, no civilization or empire was as successful as the Incas at expanding, building, and governing a large empire that at its height dominated the west of South America, from Colombia in the north to Chile in the south, over thousands of miles. An empire with a wide range of climates, different peoples, different landscapes, but a single almighty emperor, the Sapa Inca, who ruled over his land from his capital, Cusco, in modern Peru. In the 16th century, the Inca Empire was still young, and maybe it would have expanded even more. But disaster struck it from the north, from Central America, and with ships that landed on the Pacific coast. Mysterious invaders from an unknown continent arrived and brought down the empire. They were accompanied and even preceded by devastating epidemics. The empire fell into civil war. They managed to capture the Sapa Inca, and they were helped by some of the subjugated peoples that now turned against their previous masters, the Spanish conquistadors, because it was them who were looking for conquests, treasures, and glory, and they found all three well beyond their wildest dreams. In a few years, the glorious empire of the Incas was dislocated, conquered, and colonized. The majority of the former subjects of the Sapa Inca either died of unknown diseases or were enslaved. The empire was no more, and no new indigenous South American civilization would ever rise again. But this does not erase the past, and this is what we will explore tonight. From the first arrivals of human beings in South America to the rise and fall of the Inca Empire. So, as I was telling you, the Incas were the last of various civilizations in the Andes Mountains, the mountain range that stretches south to north in South America, from Chile and Argentina in the south, across Bolivia, Peru, Ecuador, all the way north to Colombia. This region of the world is regarded as one of the cradles of urban civilizations. The cradles, that is to say, the place where human civilizations, with cities with a relatively high degree of complexity, arose by themselves without being derivatives of another civilization that already had acquired these characteristics. These pristine civilizations were all based on an agricultural model that produced enough food to sustain people not working in food production: administrators, priests, artisans. By definition, people who live in cities don't spend time, or not all of their time, producing or gathering food. So, in order to have cities, you need food surpluses produced by others. Based on that definition of what a civilization is, there are at least 4 cradles in the Old World: in ancient China, in India, in Mesopotamia, and in Egypt. These are all places where urban civilizations arose, starting more than 5,000 years ago. As far as we know, none of these early civilizations in these places had a president. And there are 2 more of these cradles in the Americas: one in Mesoamerica, roughly the south of modern Mexico, which is the place where peoples like the Olmecs, Toltecs, the Maya, the Aztecs lived, and one in South America, centered on Peru. The oldest civilization or urban culture in South America, and actually in all of America, is one called Caral Supe, near the Pacific coast, in the center of Peru. Its oldest archaeological remains have been dated to 5,500 years ago, and this civilization included various population centers, towns, or cities, as many as 30. The main one is called Caral, and because it was the largest and most spectacular one, it gave its name to the entire culture. And it is a really impressive sight, despite its age, with pyramids and elaborate urbanism. The people of the Caral Supe civilization practiced agriculture, and it is not clear that it was their primary source of food. It is possible, making them unusual among early civilizations, that marine resources, such as fish and shellfish, played an even more important role in their diet. Of course, when we define civilization with criteria like cities, a writing system, an agriculture, a state, and its administration, a society with hierarchy, this is a way of looking at human cultures that is not completely neutral or independent. There is a point of view. This definition was decided or formulated by scholars and archaeologists who themselves are the product, descendants of such urban cultures, And this is not a new phenomenon. Already in antiquity, the ancient Egyptians, Greeks, Romans, Chinese judged other cultures based on what they knew, and oftentimes very harshly. But returning to the present, such a definition of civilization could end up excluding certain cultural traits, such as the absence of a writing system in societies where knowledge is transmitted orally, or the absence of stone architecture, since structures built from wood or other perishable materials do not always leave lasting traces. On the other hand, it is difficult to study ancient cultures that left no trace behind. Without remains to examine or written records to read, even their existence can be hard to establish, leaving little tangible evidence to work with. It is also a fact that cultures without cities, or at least food surpluses, cannot place themselves on a path of steady technical progress, of accumulation of knowledge generation after generation. New technical discoveries and their transmission require a degree of specialization within the population, as well as a sufficiently large community to ensure that knowledge survives the loss of any one individual. Written documents are obviously a great plus here. Without these characteristics, without this basic prosperity, it is impossible for a human group to progress technically. And this is why there is not really an alternative definition of what civilization is. Civilization requires a large group of people sharing a common culture with a relatively complex society in which there are different roles and hierarchies. This is why urbanization, a written system, and a list of discoveries are pertinent criteria. It is also interesting to compare these pristine or primary civilizations around the world, because they share the traits even though they were not in contact. Their cultural and social traits tell us of how human beings adapt to a necessity, to the environment, to a geography, the climate. And there are also similarities that appear spontaneously in human groups that were very distant and were never in contact. So these comparisons tell us of our capacity to adapt and also what we have in common as a species, as social animals. So coming back to South America, the Andes were one such cradle of early civilization. And civilization started very quickly there because it was also one of the last, if not the last, big regions of the world to be populated by humans. It is believed that the first humans reached South America via the Isthmus of Panama. After spreading through North America, and the earliest evidence of settlement in the Andean region dates back to around 15,000 BC, about 17,000 years ago. As I mentioned, the first evidence of an urban civilization appeared in the 4th millennium BC, Caral Supe in Peru. And after that, archaeology indicates that various other Andean cultures, from Colombia to Chile, lasted for centuries and declined or were absorbed by others. We are talking of several thousands of years before the Incas appeared as a state. But during this time, probably due to distances and an absence of contact with other continents, Andean civilizations or Andean cultures maintained particular traits that made them unique in the world. So, what are these traits? First, as far as we know, none of them ever developed a written language, but instead, they used a way of conveying information called the quipu. The quipu consists of a main string to which more strings, more cords, are attached in different colors and with knots. Quipus can be of different sizes. The word quipu means knot in most varieties of Quechua. Quechua is the family of languages that was and remains spoken in and around Peru. So a quipu could have only a few chords or up to thousands, in which case it could contain as much information as a book. So quipus were a way of encoding numeric information, collecting data, keeping records, keeping track of the calendar, or for military organization or taxes. The cultures that used them could give different meanings to the colors, the knots, and the distances between the knots. Because a quipu is an object or a method to convey information, like a book can be, it is not a language. And actually, the knowledge of reading them disappeared during colonial times in the Andes. So the information in the new ancient surviving quipus that we still have can no longer be read. It has been argued, and this is controversial, that quipus were more than that and were actually a written language in its own right. This was never formally proven, but it was observed that some patterns of knots and colors could have been used to designate places or possibly names of people or even dates. This could suggest that the system would have been used as a kind of writing system, one in which colors, knots, and distances between knots would have replaced the symbols, the alphabet, or ideograms and pictograms that we are familiar with in other writing systems. But there is no definitive proof of this. It seems the knowledge necessary to read quipus was always limited to a small minority of people. Maybe because the information enclosed in them was strategically important. It certainly was in the Inca Empire, where very few people apparently could decipher a quipu. This likely also made the loss of this knowledge more likely. Apart from this original system to store information, Andean civilizations had other specificities. Another one was the absence of wheeled vehicles. They never used the wheel to make chariots or wheelbarrows. This is surprising because this type of vehicle appeared relatively early in civilizations of the Old World. These are cheap and inefficient ways of improving productivity and transporting things. Of course, many Andean cultures lived in mountains, where the use of wheeled vehicles was not always viable. But not all of them. There are also deserts and plateaus that are flat. So a better reason for this absence of wheels could be the absence of draft animals. There were no horses or camels or cattle in the region, and this didn't leave many options. The llama was the domesticated animal that came closest to a horse. But llamas are not that strong. They can only carry about a fourth of their weight, a maximum of 100 pounds. And so they were not big or strong enough to be used for plowing or as riding animals. So the transportation of goods was made only by foot, with llamas carrying up to their 100 pounds on their backs or by people. Yet another original trait of these cultures was the absence of money and markets, of markets where you buy things. We don't exactly know how their economies worked. This is still debated. But a major difference with others is that no coins or places for trade could ever be found in their ruins, contrary to civilizations of the Old World. So between the absence of currency and of physical places where to trade, it seems the economy was organized on reciprocity and redistribution, maybe at the scale of a community, a village, a city, or even a state. Goods were held in common and shared among individuals or families according to an allocation system that remains unclear, though not necessarily an egalitarian one. Maybe it was between people of the same social standing. But these Andean societies also had very fierce hierarchies. There was an elite of nobles alongside a large population of common people, and the two did not share the same means or status. This, too, was a feature of the Inca civilization that had its origins in much earlier times. To conclude that list of specificities, I could mention one last aspect of all the cradles of civilizations. The Andean one is probably the one with the most natural challenges to deal with when you compare it to others, especially in the Old World. You see that the regions where urban civilizations flourished had a warm climate, but not too warm, fertile land. If you think about Egypt, Mesopotamia, or the Indus Valley, they had a relatively flat and abundant arable land. These were all positive factors for agricultural surpluses to appear. In comparison, Andean peoples were not dealt a very good hand. The Andean environment is more challenging. The first known civilization I mentioned earlier appeared on the coast of Peru, in the desert that was very arid and where only irrigation made agriculture possible. The same in valleys crossed by rivers coming from the Andes. There is a lot of water because glaciers store it in the mountains and release it in warmer seasons. But these rivers, flowing in valleys and straight to the Pacific Ocean in a few hundred miles at most, are very different from the slow and large rivers of ancient China, India, or the Middle East. So water had to be retained to irrigate fields, and there is also a scarcity of flat lands in the Andes. As soon as you start climbing and above 10,000 feet, that's 3,000 meters, the temperature becomes very cold. It can freeze at night at any time of the year. Many parts of the Andes are also very dry. Rainfall is scarce, and the soil is thin. both of which make agriculture more difficult. And yet these ancient cultures often appeared in the mountains, where the conditions were some of the harshest. They came up with solutions like terraces for agriculture, irrigation, warm clothing, the optimization of every possible resource, and actually the kind of redistributive economy that seems to dominate in these cultures may have been a consequence of these harsh conditions. The deep understanding that survival was difficult and depended on society as a whole may have prevented more individualistic conceptions of life from emerging. It has been proposed as a hypothesis that this kind of phenomenon also appeared in parts of Asia, like in Japan or some regions of China, and contributed to shape societies and individuals' psychologies. In any case, a defining feature of these ancient Andean cultures is their ability to adapt and make the most of fundamentally harsh conditions. So, as you see, they had their unique traits, from the absence of a writing system as we generally understand it, to these adaptation skills, or the absence of cattle or horses, and yet, like another cradles of civilization, they discovered a lot of essential techniques: pottery, weaving and textile, metallurgy. Even though pre-Columbian cultures in the Americas largely remained at a Bronze Age level of metallurgy and did not smelt iron, they only encountered iron tools and weapons with the arrival of the Spanish. And apart from techniques, these people elaborated complex societies and states with a particularly efficient administration. We'll see that when I tell you about the Inca Empire. They acquired a good understanding of astronomy, something common to many pre-Columbian civilizations, rich and diversified production of crafts and art pieces. They perfected their agriculture, and so, even without wheeled vehicles or iron tools, these were really advanced cultures for their time. Apart from Coral Supe, which I already mentioned, other major ancient Andean civilizations include the Valdivia culture in modern-day Ecuador, another coastal settled culture that flourished almost at the same time between the 4th and the 2nd millennia BC. There was also the Chavin culture in the Peruvian highlands in the 1st millennium BC. This one was contemporary to classical Greece. In the 1st millennium AD, there was the Nazca culture, also in Peru, famous for these large lines that they created that represented giant animals seen from the sky. And also in the 1st millennium, as the Roman Empire rose and fell and Europe entered the Dark Ages, other cultures appeared like the Moche, Chachapoyas, or the Wari and Tiwanaku empires, early precursors to the Inca Empire. Some of these cultures were from the Pacific coast, some from the mountains, and some on the other side of the Andes. The Chachapoyas, for example, lived in cloud forests, that is to say, humid, high-altitude tropical forests in the northeast of Peru. And in the 2nd millennium, in the centuries prior to the colonial conquest, plenty of different kingdoms, chiefdoms, or federations sharing similar cultures and languages kept appearing, like the Muisca in Colombia, the Chimu in the north of Peru, the Aymara kingdoms in Bolivia that replaced this Tiwanaku Empire I mentioned earlier. And I'm only listing some of the most famous. There were many more. These states had one or several urban centers, and some of them expanded, subjugating other peoples or forming federations with peoples who wanted to join them. This is what the Tiwanaku Empire did. It originated from the Altiplano, the second largest high plateau in the world after Tibet. It is mostly in modern Bolivia, but there are bits in Peru and Chile, even though it is called an empire, and it did expand well beyond its base, with either colonies or settlements that imitated it. It is unsure whether Tiwanaku was a state with an army and one or several ruling dynasties. It may have been more akin to a kind of federation of peoples. Although Tiwanaku left behind substantial architecture, the most famous example being the Gateway of the Sun, a monumental stone gate, there is, contrary to one might expect, little evidence of defensive structures or significant weaponry in the archaeological record. So this suggests that Tiwanaku could have been more of a cultural and religious area rather than a kingdom. Little is known about it, but what is certain is that in the centuries prior to the emergence of the Inca Empire, Tiwanaku occupied or covered the region where the Incas would emerge, and so it influenced them significantly. At the same time as Tiwanaku, another formation to the northwest was the Wari Empire. Here again, it is called empire, but it could have been a political formation of uncertain nature, or maybe just a network of towns and villages sharing the same culture. We don't know. The Wari lasted a bit longer and also influenced the future Incas. The early history of the Incas is full of question marks because there are no written documents that we would know of. And so, the only elements that helped recreate it are archaeology and the oral tradition that existed in the 16th century at the time of the conquest and was collected, probably imperfectly, and at a time when the line between history and myth was not very clear. But still, the main lines of this history could be established with a good level of certainty. So once the Tiwanaku and Wari empires dislocated, they were replaced in the 12th century by a collection of small kingdoms. I mentioned these Aymara kingdoms of the Altiplano earlier that succeeded Tiwanaku to the south of Peru and west of Bolivia were covered by numerous small states and independent tribes. The Inca people were one of them. The legend says that in the early 13th century, the Incas were ruled by a man called Manco Capac, and he would have been the founder of the Inca civilization. In reality, Manco Capac could very well have existed, but it is uncertain because he is known mainly through legends, chronicles, that retell the foundation of what would become an empire. Apart from that, there is no tangible proof that he existed. But in any case, the first Incas formed a small kingdom, a small city-state, like there were many at the time in the area of the city of Cusco. And for about 200 years, this little kingdom, ruled by kings, existed and prospered before it became the seat of the Inca Empire. But it is time to do a bit of etymology. We speak of Inca Empire or the Incas, but this was not how these people call themselves. The Incas referred to their empire as Tawantinsuyu, a word from Quechua that means the quartet or the group of 4 provinces. In Quechua, Tawa means 4 and Ntin is a suffix that means a group. So Tawantinsuyu means a group of 4 things or 4 elements taken together, and Suyu is a region or a province. So Tawantinsuyu is a quartet of provinces, the 4 provinces of the Inca Empire that met at the capital. But Inca is originally not the name of the people. It means ruler or lord in Quechua. And centuries ago, the term Inca was probably understood with a broader sense. It also included the nobles that ruled over the mass of the population. So the term Inca named a small elite of rulers, the masters. It is only in modern times that the Incas became the name of the people as a whole, the people that populated the Inca Empire. The emperors and before them, the kings of Cusco, were called Sapa Inca. Sapa means the only one, so we could translate this title as supreme or unique ruler. I mentioned before that Inca society had a hierarchy. At its peak, its population could have reached about 10 to 12 million people spread along the Andes from Ecuador to Chile. But the number of nobles, people that governed locally or from the court of the emperor in Cusco, has been estimated between 15,000 and 40,000, less than 0.5% of the population. So the Incas, the rulers, were certainly a small group. With these numbers, there would have been about 300 common people for one noble. For comparison, the number of nobles in European medieval societies was estimated to be between 1 and 3% of the population, depending on the countries and the periods. It could vary a lot. For example, in the 18th century, well after the Middle Ages, there were kingdoms like Poland or Castile, where the noble population could surpass 10% of the whole population. But at the same time, it was 2 to 3% in Russia, 1% in France, and less than 1% in Sweden. But still, this Inca nobility, this aristocracy, when you compare it with other societies, was really a small and exclusive group, and we can suppose from it that they lived with a degree of power and material comfort that was remarkable. So returning to the kingdom of Cusco, for about 200 years and under 8 different kings, or 8 different Sapa Inca, they started calling themselves like this. By the mid-14th century, the kingdom remained relatively small, and apart from the succession of monarchs, we don't really know much about its political life or possible conflicts with neighbors. information is limited, and, like for the figure of Manco Capac, history and legend are too intertwined to really know what happened. But all this changed with the ninth Sapa Inca of the kingdom of Cusco, Pachacuti. At the time of his accession, it seems the kingdom of Cusco was still not impressive at all. Cusco itself was a village with a royal house and a few other buildings, but it was not spectacular at all. And many kingdoms of Peru and the Altiplano were probably larger and wealthier. But Pachacuti turned out to be an expansionist king and a conqueror, and his reign lasted 33 years, from 1438 to 1471. He was the sole ruler from 1438 to 1463 for 25 years, after which power was shared, waiting for the accession of his successor. 1438, the beginning of Pachacuti's reign, was a starting point of Inca expansion. And you see that we were just 54 years before Columbus's journey to America, and 8 years before the conquest of Mexico by the Spanish against the Aztecs. This is actually the time window during which the Inca Empire rose. So, first in 3 decades, with a mix of military campaigns and diplomacy, Pachacuti enlarged the kingdom of Cusco in every direction. He created a larger kingdom of the mountains by following the Andes to the north and south of Cusco. It is widely admitted that Machu Picchu, a retreat or a family home for emperors, was built for him. As Pachacuti aged, he named one of his sons, Tupac, as a co-ruler and successor, and Tupac continued the conquest with even more success. Tupac focused on the north, conquering western Peru and Ecuador, advancing as far as what is now the border between Ecuador and Colombia. And after his father's death in 1471, he focused on the south for 20 years, annexing the entire Altiplano and the northern half of Chile, plus bits of what is now Argentina on the other side of the Andes. But what made the Incas so successful at expanding like this, not only farther than any Andean civilization that preceded them, but so much faster? The main explanation that often emerges is their economy, or their productive capacity. I already mentioned that ancient Andean economies seemed to ignore currencies and relied on communal production. The Incas had such a system, but they were very efficient at centralizing and managing production. This meant more food surpluses, and so more men available, bigger armies, and better equipment than any of their neighbors. Actually, many of their conquests at the time of Pachacuti and Tupac were diplomatic rather than military. They sent emissaries to their neighbors with gifts for the local nobles and offered them to join the Inca state. They would be better off because they would join the Inca elite themselves and benefit from the Sapa Inca's protection and highly efficient administration. As time passed, infrastructure such as roads were added to the list of advantages, so it made sense to just pledge allegiance and join the empire. That was the carrot. If they refused, there was a stick too, which was an invasion, and if they lost, they would be executed. Once the Inca Empire had acquired a critical mass of population and armies by the reign of Tupac, it made a lot of sense to just comply with it. And this explains, in part, the very fast expansion of the empire in the second half of the 15th century. It had just become irresistible. Still, there were wars with some of its neighbors, especially as the frontiers were pushed farther and farther from Cusco. For example, a large conflict that the Incas won eventually erupted with the Empire of Chimu, another empire that stretched along the coast of Peru to the south. They were stopped by a defeat in central Chile against the local Mapuche natives, who populated the south and center of Chile and also lived in the west of Argentina. So there were conflicts, battles, and occasional setbacks. Yet for the rest of the 15th century, the expansion remained remarkably rapid, and the Inca civilization never relinquished any territory they had previously conquered. Yet another explanation for the fast rise of the Incas could be a small climate shift that took place in the 15th century. Temperatures became slightly warmer in southern Peru, and precipitations increased. This opened vast lands in the mountains for agriculture, lands that could not be cultivated before. The Inca civilization had already mastered this form of mountain agriculture, using terraces to cope with thin soils and harsh conditions, allowing them to make the most of these new environments. And the boost in food and arable land could have also helped their expansion. So by the end of the reign of Tupac in 1493, at this point, Columbus had already landed in the Caribbean. But no one knew that in the Inca Empire, and the empire now stretched along the Andes for thousands of miles. It had an estimated 10 to 12 million inhabitants. For comparison, Spain around the year 1500 had an estimated population of 6.5 million. Great Britain 2.5 million. This population put the Inca Empire in 7th position worldwide, population-wise, right behind the Ottoman Empire, but ahead of the Aztec Empire, which had an estimated 6 million inhabitants. With such a size, and even more with such a quick conquest, the empire had become an amalgamation of different peoples, cultures, and languages. It takes time to integrate different peoples into a single state, and the Inca elite seems to have been very aware of the need to further integrate, to assimilate peoples into this original North-South empire that followed a mountain range over thousands of miles. Roads were built, entire populations were moved around the empire. Typically, when a new people was conquered or integrated within the boundaries of the Inca Empire, they would be sent to a completely different region. This was a way of getting people from their culture and their attachment to a particular land and ensuring that they would be more loyal. After a generation or two, their old culture would have been forgotten and replaced with Inca culture. But still, the conquest had been very quick. It was still fresh when the Spanish arrived, and in regions that were far away from Cusco, the loyalty of the local nobles, and more generally, the subjects of the Incas was still questionable. We already talked a bit about these cultural traits that were common to all Andean civilizations, of which the Incas are a part of. But apart from that, what was Inca society like? First, I give you estimates of the population of around 10 to 12 million. But these have to be taken with caution. Actually, the Incas probably knew quite well how many subjects populated each of their 4 provinces. Their administration was very developed, and records of everything were kept on quipus. But as I mentioned before, most quipus were lost, and the knowledge necessary to read them disappeared. So we ignore the numbers they contained. Estimates of the population of the Inca Empire at its peak range from 4 to 36 million inhabitants. Very low or very high estimates are often considered less credible, as they tend to be driven by political motives, such as to suggest that the colonizers barely murdered anyone, or the opposite, that they committed massacres or indirectly killed tens of millions in the Andes due to war, the diseases, and forced labor. To be clear, all of these things did happen with colonization, but it doesn't mean the numbers have to be exaggerated. Almost all estimates regarded as serious by historians fall within a range from 6 to 14 million people, and the vast majority of them worked to produce food and crafts. And as we saw before, everything was centralized when it came to production, so people would give their labor to the state, and all their basic needs, clothing or food, were covered, were given to them in exchange. Communities also had to pay a tribute in nature: grain, meat, wool, clothes in nature, because there were no coins, and precious metals like silver and gold were used to make ornaments or jewelry, but not currency. The centralization of resources also permitted the empire to redistribute when harvests were bad in a region, and so being part of the empire was kind of an insurance against famines in ancient societies. And that was still true all around the world in the 15th and 16th centuries. The food supply was always a big concern, even when there were good years and people could stock up. 2 or 3 consecutive years of bad harvests were enough to start famine anywhere. So a state capable of bringing food from hundreds of miles away and offering protection against hunger was a blessing for these communities. What did they eat, by the way? A quite wide variety of crops were cultivated. Some were native to the Americas, and they were exported later after the colonial conquest, like potatoes, tomatoes, or corn. They also had peanuts and different vegetables, different fruits, and pseudo-grains like quinoa. A pseudo-grain or a pseudo-cereal is a plant that is not a grass like cereals, but is used very much the same way. So people of the Andes didn't have wheat or rice, but they had quinoa and another pseudo-cereal called amaranth. For ordinary people, the diet was mostly plant-based, and it was complemented with fish near the coastlines and meat from guinea pigs and llamas in particular, which were raised for their wool and their meat. So, returning to the history of the empire, by the year 1520, the empire had reached its peak in terms of expansion, under Emperor Huayna Capac, who had extended its territory further to the north. But a deadly threat was coming from the north, the Spanish conquistadors. Between 1519 and 1521, the Spanish, led by Hernan Cortes, had brought down the Aztec Empire in Mexico. In the 1520s, explorations through Central America detected the existence of yet another large and wealthy empire to the south this time, and actually larger, more populated, and probably even wealthier than the Aztecs. They reached Inca territory by 1526, and with them, unwittingly, came pathogens and new diseases that, even before the war with the Spanish began, had already started to bring the Inca Empire to its knees. You know that well ahead of wars, a major cause of mortality among pre-Columbian populations in America was the introduction of pathogens that were unknown on the continent. Many people from North or South America had no pre-existing immune defenses against them. Diseases like smallpox, influenza, typhus, measles. We don't know how many subjects of the Incas this first wave of diseases killed, but it certainly disorganized the empire. It made different peoples and nobles realize that they may have an opportunity to recover their independence, and smallpox even killed the Sapa Inca Huayna Capac, together with his designated heir, triggering a succession war. As this was happening, a Spanish conquistador called Francisco Pizarro had traveled back to Spain and obtained royal approval in 1529 to conquer the Incas and govern this new land that the Spanish now called New Castile or Peru. The conquest of Mexico had been one of the most, maybe even the most, immediately profitable expeditions in history. A small group of men, aided by their advanced equipment and the political situation with different peoples ready to revolt against the Aztecs, and also a lot of luck, had been able to send back inconceivable treasures to Spain, a mountain of gold and other treasures. So they now hoped the same operation could be repeated with the Incas, and it would be repeated indeed. Pizarro had been given the green light in Spain in 1529 to invade the Incas. In 1532, he was back to South America, and he entered Inca territory with a modest force of 168 men, 27 horses, and only one cannon. That is to say, almost nothing to conquer an empire. Even with the technological advantage of gunpowder or steel armor. But once again, the conquistadors were very lucky. Following the death of the Sapa Inca Huayna Capac, and as I mentioned, a succession war had begun. Two of his sons had started this war, Huáscar and Atahualpa. In this chaos, unrest had surged in conquered provinces far from Cusco, and the epidemic was still taking its toll on the empire. The forces of Pizarro only engaged minor garrisons in present-day Ecuador to the north of the Inca Empire, and nothing special was done to stop them because the two pretenders were too busy fighting each other. The fight that finally Atahualpa won, And as he was resting near the city of Cajamarca in the north of Peru, with an army of 80,000 men, that's 500 to 1, against the Spanish, he invited Pizarro for talks. To the Incas, it was just unthinkable that anything could happen to their emperor. He was sacred, chosen by the gods, and more tangibly, he was surrounded by an army of 80,000 men. So the idea that a few dozen conquistadors would try anything probably did not even cross their minds. But the Spanish did try something. They met with Atahualpa, and on the first occasion, they attacked the Inca forces around, who were mostly unarmed. They captured the emperor and, with their emperor prisoner, the Inca soldiers, completely disoriented, obeyed orders to stop fighting. For the price of his liberty, Atahualpa was asked to fill a room from floor to ceiling with gold, and also bring twice that amount of silver, which he did. But they still didn't release him, and finally he was executed in 1533. As the emperor was now a prisoner, and the prestige of the empire had taken a huge hit, many regional leaders just rejected the Sapa Inca and turned to the Spanish for allegiance. They switched overlords, and this helped the Spanish enormously, helped them dismantle and take control of the Inca Empire, which collapsed like a house of cards. For the peoples that had lived under Inca rule, this change of overlords was certainly not positive. At best, they kept living about the same under a noble that now obeyed the Spanish. These nobles were called encomenderos. This was a system in which they managed an area and its inhabitants on behalf of the colonizers, to whom they paid taxes. For ordinary people, it meant more work, and now there were the epidemics, ravaging the Andean region on a regular basis. As I mentioned before, it had begun in the 1520s with smallpox. In the 1540s, there was typhus, and in the 1550s, influenza and smallpox again. These epidemics kept happening for about a century. They lasted into the 17th century, with more smallpox outbreaks, diphtheria, and measles. This, plus forced labor in mines and agriculture, made the indigenous population decrease dramatically along the 16th century. And even though the Spanish rule was imposed from Colombia to Chile, there was a periodic attempt to revolt and expel the Spanish until the late 18th century, but all these rebellions were crushed. The memory and the physical remains of Inca cities did not disappear, obviously. Some, like Cusco, remain populated to this day, and this is why in numerous cities of Peru you can find archaeological remains. Sometimes the foundations of buildings date back to the Inca period. All the languages that were spoken across the Inca Empire declined as Spanish replaced them, and some disappeared. But among native populations of Peru, Ecuador, and Bolivia, some are still spoken, in particular Quechua. This family of languages nowadays has about 7 million native speakers, half of them from Peru, and most of the others from Ecuador and Bolivia. We've come to the end of our little journey tonight. I hope you enjoyed this adventure, and I invite you to learn and discover more. Now you can let go and sleep. Or if you're not sleepy yet, you may pick another story from my ever-growing library. And until we meet again, good night. Sleep well.